Dorothea Binz was 17 years old when she began working at Ravensbrück. She arrived in 1939, the year the camp opened. She was hired as an auxiliary guard, an Aufseherin, with no prior training and no special requirement beyond being a German woman over the age of 16. During her first weeks, she observed, she learned the language of the camp. Roll calls at dawn and dusk, labor commandos, sanctions, the system of punishments. By the age of 20, she was supervising the punishment barracks. By 24, she was deputy commandant of the camp. Her preferred tool was a wooden cane she carried during inspection rounds and used without warning, on any part of the body, against any prisoner who seemed too slow, too visible, or simply accessible at that moment. The testimonies of survivors who describe her are consistent on one detail. Binz struck with unadorned efficiency, without apparent rage, like someone performing a technical task that required precision rather than emotion. Ravensbrück was the only Nazi concentration camp built specifically for women. It operated from May 1939 until the 30th of April 1945, when the last prisoners were liberated by Soviet troops. During that time, between 150,000 and 230,000 women of more than 40 different nationalities passed through it. Between 25,000 and 30,000 died inside the camp. Thousands more died on the evacuation marches of the final months or in the camps to which they were transferred. Exact figures do not exist because the SS destroyed the archives before liberation. The camp was built by prisoners from the adjacent men's camp of Sachsenhausen, on the shore of Lake Schwetzey in Mecklenburg, 90 kilometers north of Berlin. The lake water was only a few meters from the barbed wire. In summer, it could be smelled. Prisoners who had gone weeks without enough drinking water described that smell in their testimonies as a specific form of torture, different from hunger or forced labor, a torture of proximity without access. The camp's layout was rectangular. Barracks in parallel rows, dirt roads between them, an industrial zone with workshops where uniforms for the SS were produced, a crematorium, and the bunker. The punishment building that the prisoners knew by that generic name and that contained isolation cells, standing cells, and the room where the 25 lashes prescribed by camp regulations as a formal punishment were administered. In 1939, the first to arrive were German and Austrian political detainees, women classified as asocial, Jehovah's Witnesses, and some Roma women. Then came the Polish women, in large transports after the invasion of Poland in September of that same year. Then the Czech, French, Soviet, Dutch, Belgian, Norwegian, Yugoslav, Greek, and Hungarian women. Each new wave of arrivals brought a new language most did not understand, a different national history, a different reason for arrest. What they had in common was the entry procedure, which was the same for all of them from the first day to the last. The entry procedure began on the platform of Fürstenberg Station, 3 kilometers from the camp. The prisoners got down from the wagons, formed a column, and walked the route to the camp gates. Those 3 kilometers along the village road were public. The inhabitants of Fürstenberg saw the columns pass. Some watched, some went into their houses, some shopped in the stores along the street through which the columns passed. Upon entering the camp, the procedure was standard in the camps of the Reich, but the testimonies from Ravensbrück describe it with a particular element of deliberate humiliation. The prisoners were taken to the admission room, where they had to undress completely in front of guards and, in some periods, in front of male SS doctors. Their hair was shaved. They were assigned the camp uniform, a blue and gray striped dress, far too light for the Mecklenburg winter, and in many periods no underwear. A registration number was tattooed on their forearm. From that moment on, the number was their name inside the camp. Any guard who addressed them by their real name was violating protocol. The first authority structure they encountered was that of the Blockälteste, the Blockelders, prisoners placed by the SS in a supervisory position over their own fellow prisoners, in exchange for minimal advantages such as an individual bunk or a slightly larger ration. The Blockälteste system reproduced division among the prisoners inside the camp and made part of the daily work of control fall on the inmates themselves, relieving the guards of the most immediate surveillance. Some Blockälteste used their position to protect the most vulnerable. Others used it to exercise their own violence, additional to that of the guards, driven by the need to demonstrate loyalty to the system that gave them that relative position. The Aufseherin and guards were German civilians recruited with a salary and the status of state officials. They arrived at Ravensbrück with no specific training, received 1 or 2 weeks of basic instruction inside the camp, and were then assigned to posts. The instruction consisted mainly of learning the regulations and observing veteran guards during their rounds. What they learned by observation was accepted behavior, physical distance from the prisoners, the tone of voice used to give orders, the use of disciplinary instruments, and the implicit limits, which were broader than the written limits. Formal regulations prohibited certain forms of explicit violence. Daily practice went beyond the regulations in a way the supervisors knew and tolerated. In total, approximately 3,500 Aufseherinnen worked at Ravensbrück between 1,939 and 1,945. Most were between 16 and 25 years old when they arrived. Many came from working-class families in northern Germany. Some had previously worked in factories, shops, or as domestic servants. The salary at Ravensbrück was comparable to that of an industrial worker, with lodging and food included. Some applied for the position for economic reasons. Some because their husbands or boyfriends were stationed as guards in nearby men's camps and they wanted to be in the same area. Some because the uniform and the status of an official of the Reich offered an appeal that civilian life did not. Inside the camp, the female guards did not live among the prisoners, but in a separate block with radically different conditions: individual beds, their own dining room, free time between shifts, access to the camp canteen where cigarettes and personal use items were sold. That physical separation in living conditions had a psychological effect that historians of the camp have analyzed extensively. The distance between the world of the guards and the world of the prisoners was not only administrative, but sensory. The guards slept and ate well in the same compound where the prisoners slept 3 to a bunk and starved. That distance made possible the compartmentalization that allowed them to return to their block at the end of a shift and write letters to their families about the weather and routine life. The recruitment of Aufseherinnen intensified as the war advanced and the demand for labor for the camps increased. The SS sent representatives to factories and employment offices to recruit volunteers. In some periods, women working in industries considered non-essential to the war received notices offering transfer to the camps as officials. Those who accepted received the uniform, the salary, and the status. Those who refused did not suffer direct consequences, although some testimonies suggest that social pressure from colleagues who had accepted weighed on those who hesitated. The violence they exercised was not uniform. Some guards spent years in the camp without participating in acts of direct violence beyond the supervision of forced labor. Others built reputations for specific brutality that survivor testimonies document with names, dates, and methods. The guard Vera Salvaquart administered white pills to prisoners in the infirmary, telling them they were medicine. They were poison. Irma Grese, who passed through Ravensbrück before being transferred to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, was known among the prisoners for carrying a leather whip and a revolver and using them with an arbitrariness that made it impossible to predict what behavior might trigger a reaction. Carmen Mori, a Swiss political prisoner whom the SS placed as Blockelteste in the block for the sick, regularly beat women too weak to defend themselves. What makes the case of Carmen Mori especially revealing about the functioning of the camp is her category. She was not an SS guard, but a prisoner. She had arrived at Ravensbrück as a detainee accused of espionage, and the SS had placed her in a position of authority over other prisoners precisely because she had the capacity to exercise violence and because her position as a prisoner gave her access to the inner life of the barracks that the guards did not have. Mori used that position for years. She was tried in Hamburg in 1947, sentenced to death, and committed suicide in her cell before the sentence could be carried out. Forced labor in Ravensbrück operated through commandos, groups of prisoners assigned to specific tasks inside and outside the camp. The sewing commando worked in the Siemens workshops that the SS had installed inside the compound, producing electrical components for the German war industry. The construction commando worked on expanding the camp with the same human material the camp was destroying. The gravel commando extracted sand and stone from the lake for construction work. There were also gardening, kitchen, cleaning, and laundry commandos. The external commandos, those that left the camp to work on farms, in quarries, or in industrial facilities in the surrounding area, were considered by some prisoners an advantage because surveillance outside the perimeter was different and because contact with the outside world could produce small leaks of food or information. Other external commandos had the opposite reputation. Kilometers of marching, physical labor without adequate tools, guards with dogs, and the return to the camp at nightfall without having eaten since dawn. The Siemens Kommando deserves specific attention because it represents one of the best documented intersections between German private industry and the camp system. Siemens and Halske established its production facilities inside the Ravensbrück compound in 1942, paying the SS a daily fee for each prisoner assigned. The prisoners received no wages. They worked between 10 and 12 hours a day, producing components for military telecommunications equipment. Those who produced below the quota set by Siemens supervisors could be reported to the guards and punished with transfer to a worse commando or with formal punishments. Siemens supervisors were not SS guards and had no formal authority to punish prisoners directly, but their evaluation of productivity entered the camp's administrative records and determined real consequences. For decades, Siemens denied its participation in the slave labor system at Ravensbrück. The Hamburg trial archives and survivor testimonies documented the opposite. The construction commando was especially brutal in the early years of the camp, when the expansion of the facilities required heavy physical labor: digging, carrying materials, leveling ground. The prisoners assigned to that commando worked without gloves in the temperatures of the Mecklenburg winter, carrying loads beyond their physical capacity, with guards setting the pace by beating those who fell behind. Survivor testimonies from that commando describe hands bleeding on stone and feet that had no feeling left at the end of a winter workday. The SS, who administered Ravensbrück for 6 years, applied to the women under their control exactly the same mechanisms of systematic destruction that men's camps applied to their prisoners, with one difference that survivor testimonies consistently point out: women's specific vulnerability within the system was used as an additional instrument. The shaving of hair, which was also practiced in men's camps, had in Ravensbrück a dimension of gendered humiliation that survivors described as the first and most immediate violation of the body produced by the camp. The medical records that SS doctors kept on the prisoners included information about the menstrual cycle, which disappeared in many women within a few weeks of arrival because of caloric deficit, and that information was used in Gebhardt's experiments to determine the hormonal state of the subjects. Direct sexual violence, though less documented in the camp's formal archives than other forms of violence, appears in survivor testimonies, often enough for historians who have worked with that material to consider it part of the system of daily terror exercised by individual guards of both sexes inside the barracks and in areas of the camp where supervision was minimal. Within that system of systematic destruction, resistance took forms that were visible only from the inside. Networks of solidarity among prisoners of the same nationality were the most basic structure: sharing food, protecting the weakest, passing on information about the movements of guards, warning of selections early enough for the most vulnerable to hide or appear stronger than they were. The Polish prisoners had the densest network because they had been in the camp longer and had had more time to build it. The French women who arrived in the transports of 1,942 and 1,943 described being integrated into those networks by Polish women who did not speak their language but communicated what was essential through gestures and the parisen. Silent distribution of food. Cultural resistance was a form of survival that survivor testimonies document with a precision that reveals how much the possibility of continuing to be a person inside the camp depended on it. Groups of prisoners organized in the barracks at night after the guards had passed the final check. Recitations of poems memorized before deportation, language lessons, philosophical discussions, and retellings of books none of them could ever open again because they were in the cities from which they had been torn away. One prisoner, who had been a music teacher before the war, organized an informal choir in her barrack for months. Rehearsals were held in very low voices so as not to attract attention. The repertoire was from memory. Milena Jesenska, the Czech journalist who had been close to Franz Kafka before the war, died in Ravensbrück in May 1944. She had arrived in 1939, arrested for her activities in the resistance. In the camp, she used her journalistic abilities for a different kind of work: observing, mentally recording, and orally transmitting to other prisoners what she was seeing, building a living archive of what was happening that survived in part in the testimonies of the women she spoke with during the 5 years she spent in the camp before dying of a kidney infection. Margarete Buber-Neumann arrived at Ravensbrück in 1940 from the Soviet Union, where she had been a prisoner in the Gulag before being handed over to Nazi Germany under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Her experience of having been a prisoner in two different totalitarian systems gave her a comparative perspective that she was able to articulate after liberation in her book Under Two Dictators, published in 1948. Buber-Neumann survived the camp and became one of the most important voices on Ravensbrück in the post-war period. Her testimony was central to the Hamburg trial. Religious life inside the camp followed a pattern similar to cultural resistance. Formally forbidden, practiced on the margins of surveillance schedules, sustained by networks of people of the same faith who sought one another out and found one another within the mass of the camp. The Jehovah's Witnesses of Ravensbrück are a particular case because they arrived at the camp precisely for refusing to renounce their faith, and inside the camp they continued practicing it with a consistency that the guards documented with growing irritation in internal reports. Jehovah's Witnesses refused to give the Nazi salute, refused to work in the production of war material even when that meant punishment, and maintained mutual support networks that the SS repeatedly tried to dissolve without ever succeeding completely. Several testimonies from prisoners of other categories describe Jehovah's Witnesses as the most cohesive group in the camp and as the women who most often helped prisoners from other categories without asking for anything in return. The consistency of that behavior within a system designed to destroy the cohesion of any group had an effect on the camp as a whole that went beyond individual acts of help. It demonstrated, in daily practice, that it was possible to maintain an identity and a recognizable set of values even inside Ravensbrück, and that demonstration was itself an act of resistance against the central logic of the camp, which was not only to kill, but to turn people into instruments without a will of their own, before killing them or discarding them. Hunger in Ravensbrück followed the same logic as in other camps of the system. The daily ration was insufficient from the beginning and deteriorated progressively as the war advanced and the German supply system collapsed. The standard ration in the camp's early years consisted of 1 liter of turnip or beet soup at midday and a piece of bread at night. That ration could sustain a person at rest. It could not sustain a person working 10 or 12-hour days of physical labor under camp conditions. The difference between what was given and what the body needed to function was expressed in the medical language that some prisoner doctors used in their clandestine records as an accumulated caloric deficit that produced measurable effects on body weight, bone density, the immune system, and cognitive function over the course of weeks. In less clinical terms, constant hunger changed the way prisoners thought, the decisions they made, the relationships they built or destroyed. Several survivors described stealing food from barrack companions and needing decades to process the guilt of that act. Others described organizing redistribution networks inside the blocks so that the weakest received more than their assigned ration, at the risk that this redistribution would be detected and punished. The economy of scarcity inside Ravensbrück produced both solidarity and betrayal, sometimes among the same people on different days. Cold was the third axis of systematic deterioration. Ravensbrück lies at a latitude where winter temperatures regularly fall below -15 degrees Celsius. The striped uniform was not designed for those temperatures. The barracks had central stoves that, in the camp's early years, heated only marginally, and in the final years, with coal scarce, did not heat at all. Roll call, the appel, was held twice a day, at dawn and at dusk, and the prisoners had to stand in rows for as long as the count took, which depended on whether the number matched the administrative records. When it did not match, for any reason, the appel was extended. Testimonies describe appels lasting several hours in sub-zero temperatures, with prisoners fainting or dying of hypothermia during the count. The bodies of those who fell remained in the formation because the count had to balance, and the bodies counted. The bunker, the punishment building, had 2 types of cells. The regular cells were small rooms with a bed and a barred window, where prisoners were locked up for periods ranging from days to weeks for infractions, such as trying to communicate with the outside world, stealing food, or resisting a direct order. The standing cells were structures of approximately 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters, the height of a person, where it was impossible either to sit or lie down. Prisoners were locked in those cells overnight, standing, only to return to work during the day. The formal punishment of 25 lashes was administered in a room of the bunker with the prisoner tied to a wooden bench, her bare back exposed, before an appointed guard, and an administrative witness who counted the blows aloud. The testimonies describing that procedure agree that the silence after the room was as audible as the blows during it. Soviet prisoners began arriving at Ravensbrück in 1941 after the start of Operation Barbarossa. Their situation inside the camp was different from that of other nationalities for reasons the Nazi regime openly articulated. In SS racial ideology, Soviet Slavic women occupied the lowest rung of the racial hierarchy, below Polish and Czech women, who in turn were below German and Austrian political prisoners. That hierarchy was expressed in harsher commando assignments, less access to the infirmary, and placement in the most deteriorated and overcrowded barracks. Soviet women who arrived at Ravensbrück as civilians deported from the occupied territories also faced the language problem in its most acute form. Instructions in the camp were given in German, with translation into Polish in some cases but rarely into Russian, and misunderstanding an order could be interpreted by a guard as disobedience and punished accordingly. Jewish women of different nationalities who arrived at Ravensbrück as part of the general transports of the Reich received the most degrading treatment in the camp's category system. In the early years, Jewish groups in Ravensbrück were relatively small compared with groups of German political prisoners or Polish detainees. From 1944 onward, when the Auschwitz system began to overflow and transfer some of its prisoners to camps in the Western Reich, large groups of Hungarian, Polish, and Czech Jewish women arrived at Ravensbrück in a state of extreme physical deterioration after having passed through Auschwitz. These women were already at the limit of what a body can endure, and the camp they reached was already at the limit of its physical capacity to house them. Living together inside the barracks, women of 20 or more different nationalities, aged from 15 to 75, from different administrative categories, with radically different cultural and religious backgrounds, produced a social dynamic inside the camp that survivor testimonies describe with more nuance than the uniform image of solidarity that post-war narratives about the camps tend to project. There was real solidarity, support networks that saved lives, acts of generosity that required personal risk. And there were also internal hierarchies, distrust between groups of different nationalities, competition for the minimal resources available, and in some cases violence between prisoners of different categories, which the SS guards observed with an indifference they interrupted only when the conflict affected camp order. The camp infirmary, the Revier, was a layered system. In theory, it was the place where sick prisoners received medical care. In practice, it was also the place where selections were made to eliminate those the SS considered too deteriorated to be useful, and where medical experiments supervised by Dr. Karl Gebhardt and his team were carried out from 1942 onward. The experiments on the Kaninchen, the rabbits, the Polish prisoners on whose bodies artificial wound infections, bone transplants, and amputations without consent were tested, are extensively documented in other records. What the Revier represented as an everyday structure, beyond the experiments, was the specific paradox of a place that was supposed to heal and also killed. Entering the Revier with a curable illness could end in selection for the gas chamber if the guard on duty or the visiting SS doctor decided the prisoner was not worth the expenditure of medical attention. The category system in Ravensbrück determined from arrival what kind of treatment a prisoner would receive. Cloth triangles sewn onto the uniform indicated the category: red for political prisoners, black for asocials, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses, pink for lesbians, brown for Sinti and Roma, yellow for Jews. Categories determined assignment to commandos, access to the infirmary, and the risk of being selected for experiments or executions. Jewish women were on the lowest rung of that formal hierarchy, although in practice daily violence did not always respect administrative categories. Executions inside the camp began in documented form in 1942 and intensified in the following years. The most frequent procedure was a shot to the back of the head in the crematorium courtyard or inside the bunker. Death sentences had to be approved by the SS central leadership in Berlin, but testimonies also document extrajudicial executions in the barracks and courtyards, carried out by guards or by the camp commandant without formal proceedings. Friedrich Suren, commandant of Ravensbrück from 1942 onward, signed execution orders and supervised their implementation with the same administrative logic Stangl had applied in Treblinka. The camp was a system that had to function efficiently, and efficiency included the elimination of elements the system considered non-productive or potentially dangerous. The gas chamber at Ravensbrück began operating in the spring of 1945, in the final months of the camp. It was not an installation built from the beginning, as in pure extermination camps. It was a late addition, installed in an existing building near the crematorium, when the SS decided that the rate of deaths by hunger, disease, and summary execution was not sufficient to manage the volume of prisoners they no longer considered useful. The chamber was operationally connected to the youth camp of Uckermark, a satellite compound established in late 1944, a few kilometers from Ravensbrück, where prisoners selected as unable to work were sent. The SS administrative language called this group the unproductiven, the unproductive. The language the prisoners of Ravensbrück used when they spoke of Uckermark among themselves was more direct. Before 1944, Uckermark had functioned as a camp for young German women classified as asocial, minors sent there by the regime for reasons ranging from delinquency to simple rebellion against the party's standards of conduct. In the autumn of 1944, it was converted to a different function, receiving prisoners selected at Ravensbrück as too deteriorated to continue being productive. Conditions in Uckermark during that period were worse than in the main camp. Smaller food rations, no labor commandos that at least kept prisoners moving, unheated barracks during the winter months. The Uckermark camp was not designed to sustain life indefinitely. It was designed to accelerate the death of the women it received. From Uckermark, groups of prisoners were transferred to the gas chamber installed at Ravensbrück. The transfer was carried out in trucks, which the prisoners inside Uckermark observed with the same silent understanding with which prisoners in other camps had watched the trucks of Treblinka or the Sonderkommandos of Auschwitz. Some prayed before boarding, some resisted and were beaten into the truck. Some walked in silence. Estimates of the number of people murdered in the Ravensbrück gas chamber during those final months vary between 3,000 and 5,500, a range that reflects the partial destruction of records and the difficulty of distinguishing in the surviving archives between deaths in the chamber, deaths in Uckermark from abandonment, and those executed directly in the main camp. What the testimonies of survivors who lived through those final months document consistently is the acceleration. The pace of selections increased as the Soviet front approached from the east, as if the SS needed to complete a task before someone arrived who could interrupt it. The selection process for Uckermark was an extension of the appell in its most explicit form. Prisoners were forced to run or pass before a medical commission that determined within seconds who could work and who could not. Those who stumbled, limped, seemed too thin or too old, were separated. Some knew where they were going. Others were told the story that Uckermark was a convalescent camp where they would rest until they recovered. In the final weeks of the camp, when selections accelerated in order to empty Ravensbrück before the Soviet advance, the guards stopped maintaining the fiction of the convalescent camp. The speed of the process made explanation unnecessary. In the winter of 1944 to 1945, the camp was on the verge of physical collapse. Its population had grown to more than 8 times its original capacity. Evacuation transports from the eastern camps, from Auschwitz and its satellites, from the Polish camps that the Soviet advance had forced to evacuate, arrived at Ravensbrück with women in a state of extreme deterioration that the barracks no longer had the capacity to absorb. Deaths from typhus, dysentery, and starvation multiplied. Bodies accumulated in the crematorium faster than the oven could incinerate them. Suren attempted to manage that collapse with the instruments he had, accelerating selections for Uckermark, increasing the pace of executions, and beginning to evacuate parts of the camp population westward in forced marches that reproduced in Mecklenburg what the death marches were producing across all of Central Europe that winter. The prisoners who set out on those marches in January and February, 1945, did so in camp clothing, without sufficient caloric reserves to walk for hours in sub-zero temperatures. Those who fell were shot by convoy guards or abandoned along the road. On the 28th of April 1945, Suren negotiated with Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross the evacuation of a group of prisoners in buses. Bernadotte had entered negotiations with Suren in the framework of the White Buses operation, a Swedish and Danish humanitarian effort to rescue Scandinavian prisoners from Nazi camps, which Bernadotte had begun managing in January of that year with Himmler's ambiguous authorization. The negotiations stretched over weeks and resulted in the departure of several thousand prisoners in the white buses towards Sweden and Denmark. The first to leave, according to the initial agreement, were Scandinavian prisoners. Later it was expanded to include French prisoners and other nationalities. The Polish women, who were the largest group and had been in the camp the longest, were among the last to be included on the evacuation lists, creating an internal tension in the camp during those days that survivor testimonies describe clearly. The knowledge that the white buses existed and that a list determined who could board them and who could not. Suren expected that his cooperation with Bernadotte would earn him some form of protection when the Allies arrived. He handed the camp over to the Red Cross on the 30th of April 1945 and fled west disguised as a private soldier. He was captured by the Americans, identified, and handed over to the British authorities. His trial was part of the Hamburg proceedings. He was executed in June 1950. On the 30th of April 1945, Soviet troops entered the camp. They found between 3,000 and 4,000 prisoners who had not been evacuated or killed before their arrival. Many were in physical conditions that Soviet military doctors described in their reports as the most severe deterioration they had observed in any camp in European territory they had liberated up to that point. Some could not walk. Some could not be identified by nationality or name because they were too weakened to speak and carried no documentation. Some died in the days immediately after liberation, when the body that had survived the camp could not survive the speed of emergency medical care. Dorothea Binz was captured before the end of May 1945. She was tried in Hamburg, sentenced to death, and executed on the 2nd of May 1947, together with 11 other convicts from the same trial. She was 26 years old. In the photographs taken during the trial, she appears with the same cropped dark hair and the same neutral expression that survivors had described in the camp courtyards. During the trial, she showed no articulated remorse. She answered questions about her behavior in the camp with a precision that the court interpreted as confirmation of the facts, not as mitigation of responsibility. Wanda Wojtasik was 19 when she arrived at Ravensbrück in 1941. She was a university student in Kraków, arrested in a roundup for her activities in the Polish resistance. She was operated on in the legs as part of Gebhardt's experimental program in 1942. She survived the camp. She survived the operations. For decades after the war, she organized Polish survivors, documented their testimonies, and appeared in trials as a witness. Her testimony in the Hamburg trial was part of the case file that led to the conviction of the doctors who had participated in the experiments. What she described in that testimony, decades after liberation, with the same precision she had had on the first day, was the procedure, the stretcher, the anesthesia, the incision, waking up with the bandages, the pain that lasted for months, and the total absence of any explanation of what had been done to them and why. Not the spectacular brutality of blows or executions, which the camp also produced, but that specific form of medical violence that used a woman's body as laboratory material while she was aware that this was exactly what was happening and could do nothing to prevent it. The scars on the legs of the survivors of the experiments remained visible decades after liberation. Those who lived into the 1980s and 1990s could still show them to researchers who asked for documentation. Some did. Others preferred not to show anything more. Every choice was legitimate. What the camp had done to those bodies did not end on the 30th of April 1945. It continued in the way those women slept, in what they could or could not do with their legs, in what they felt when a doctor asked them to lie down on an examination table for a routine procedure. Ravensbrück is today in what is now the state of Brandenburg, beside Lake Schwetzee, in the town of Fürstenberg. It is a memorial and a museum. The original barracks were not preserved because they were demolished by the Soviets after the war to build a military barracks that operated on that site until German reunification in 1990. What remained standing was the crematorium, the bunker, and some of the auxiliary buildings. The Hamburg proceedings concerning the crimes of the camp were held in 4 rounds between 1946 and 1948. 21 of the 41 people tried were sentenced to death. Carmen Mori committed suicide in her cell before execution. Vera Salvaquart was executed. Greta Bösel was executed. Karl Gebhardt was executed. Herta Oberheiser, the only female doctor in the experimental program, was released in 1952 and practiced medicine in Germany until a survivor recognized her in her office. The exact calculation of how many people died in Ravensbrück does not exist because the archives were destroyed. The estimates historians consider most solid stand at around 45,000 deaths inside the main compound. Dorothea Binz was executed on the 2nd of May, 1947. She was 26 years old. She had learned the trade at 17, in her first weeks in the camp, and perfected it over 6 years without any record indicating that at any point between the first day and the last, she ever came to call it anything else. The lake is still only a few meters from where the barbed wire once stood. In summer, the water can be smelled from the memorial.